While many of us have the luxury of living in a peaceful place, there are many areas of the world that aren't so stable. Be it social unrest, natural disasters, wars, or famines, there are some places that are more volatile than others. Here are the 15 most volatile areas on Earth. Number 15. Tijuana. While there are plenty of crime-ridden places in Mexico, Tijuana takes the cake for being the worst of them all. Located on the border with the United States, it stands apart for being consistently ranked as one of the most dangerous cities in the world. That's because the city recorded a whopping 84.8 deaths per 100,000 people in the year 2020, and this can largely be attributed to the intense gang rivalries in the city. More specifically, it's a hotbed for violent clashes between the Sinaloa and Tijuana cartels, who fight over the market share of the lucrative illegal meth trade. Due to its proximity to the border, Tijuana is also a link in many human trafficking and drug-dealing networks, and the maintenance of these lines often result in brutal acts of violence. Therefore, while Tijuana may be a common stop for those traveling down to Mexico, we don't suggest sticking around for too long. Number 14. Syria. The Syrian war has captured headlines for most of the 2010s, and thus it's not hard to see why Syria is relatively volatile. You see, the conflict in this country first began in 2011, when pro-democracy protesters began to fight against the dictatorship of Bashar al-Assad. However, these groups soon began to be overshadowed by radical Islamist terrorist groups such as ISIS, and as a result, 5.6 million refugees ended up fleeing the country to settle in either neighboring countries, or if they were willing to take the risk, to European countries. Now, while those who went abroad face their challenges, they are almost invariably living a better life than those back in Syria. That's because there have been about 500,000 deaths in the region since the beginning of the conflict. And when this is coupled with the country's rising inflation and COVID-19 crisis, life in this country is absolutely brutish. So when you further consider that the country is still split up into 7 occupation zones, we think it's fair to say that the situation in Syria is quite volatile. Number 13. Arequipa. While Peru's capital city of Lima may be the only Peruvian city that most people know, it turns out that the city of Arequipa is nearly as important. After all, it is Peru's second largest city and is widely considered to be one of the country's most important manufacturing hubs. However, the city's nearby misty volcano constantly threatens to end all of this productivity in an instant. After all, according to Peru's Institute of Geology, Mining and Extraction, Arequipa is the world's third most at-risk city in regard to volcanic activity, as the misty volcano is still very active. And while there have been no major eruptions since 1985, in the event of a major eruption, the entirety of the city would be within the volcano's reach, and this would absolutely devastate the local people living there. Therefore, while Arequipa is a beautiful city that should be on every traveler's bucket list, we suggest staying far away in the event of a volcanic eruption. Number 12. Afghanistan. While foreign intervention is something that is supposed to help countries get out of trouble, at times it can cause just as many problems as it solves. A prime example of this reality in action is in Afghanistan, which began to feel the full force of an American invasion after the fall of the Twin Towers in 2001. However, while the United States was initially successful, the brutality of their invasion caused many local people to support the Taliban, as they were and even today are seen by many Afghans as freedom fighters working for Afghan independence rather than as radical Islamic terrorists. As a result, when the Taliban began resurgence in the mid-2000s, the United States could do nothing but pour more military backup. And while the Taliban have been defeated in many areas, the future doesn't look bright. That's because as of now, the Afghan government has very little legitimacy in the eyes of the people. And while both Trump and Biden have begun to remove troops, many observers believe that the Taliban will quickly overwhelm the government forces if the Americans evacuate. Therefore, while Afghanistan has made some strides towards democracy in recent years, the constant threat of the Taliban and the continued acts of bombing and violence against the U.S. make continued chaos in the country quite likely. Number 11. San Francisco. San Francisco is one of America's most iconic cities, as it's home to the Golden Gate Bridge, Alcatraz, and its famed system of cable streetcars. However, it's also one of the riskiest places to live within the United States. as it's located above three major fault lines that could cause an earthquake at very short notice. More specifically, the area around San Francisco intersects the San Andreas, Hayward, and Calaveras fault lines, and these have historically been the cause of some pretty crazy earthquakes. The worst in recent memory was caused by the San Andreas fault line in 1906, as it was a 7.9 magnitude quake that led to the deaths of about 3,000 people. And while it hasn't spewed out something this bad in a while, both the San Andreas and Hayward faults are expected to see some major tectonic action in the near future. Therefore, while San Francisco may be a beautiful city to visit, we suggest seeing it soon, as it's only a matter of time until at least part of it is destroyed. Number 10. Haiti. As far as volatility goes, few countries in the world are as down on their luck as Haiti. You see, Haiti became one of the first non-European countries to become a republic after achieving independence in 1806, and was almost immediately ostracized from every European nation due to it presenting a threat to the established colonial order. This forced it to borrow heavily at extremely high interest rates in order to sustain itself, and this has not only stunted its growth, but led to political instability. As such, it has been subject to multiple dictators over its existence, and even today corruption and poverty run rampant, as much of the country's natural resources have been destroyed. To make matters worse, Haiti is located in a seismically active zone, and in 2010 it faced a magnitude 7 earthquake that was so destructive that the country still hasn't recovered from it to this day. When you further consider that Haiti is now going through a period of hyperinflation, it becomes clear that the entire island is relatively volatile in almost every possible way. Number 9. Tornado Alley. No one likes to be anywhere near a natural disaster, but in Tornado Alley, the chances of one occurring right outside your doorstep are pretty high. Located in the United States, Tornado Alley is a region where tornadoes are extremely common, and while a universal definition of what states fall under it has not yet been made, it roughly encompasses the central United States, with states such as Oklahoma, Kansas, Arkansas, and Tennessee being right in the middle of it. About 1,000 tornadoes occur in this region per year, and according to scientists, the area's flat terrain, unstable atmospheric conditions, and competing air masses are to blame, as the differences in air temperature in the region often lead to supercell thunderstorms that in many cases touch down on the ground as funnels and become a tornado. If you happen to be in Tornado Alley during a tornado warning, we highly suggest taking shelter in a basement or interior room of a building, as it's these areas that are the least likely to be impacted by a terrible tornado.
We are constantly adding more people to the Top 5's production team to bring you all the best content. Be sure to subscribe with notifications on and hit the like button.
Number 8. Jerusalem. Jerusalem is easily one of the hottest cities in the world, as it's a significant place of worship for practitioners of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. However, what's not so holy about Jerusalem is its violence, as its unstable makeup and rising tensions makes it one of the most volatile cities out there. You see, the Old World city is roughly divided into Muslim, Christian, Armenian, and Jewish quarters, and while they have existed relatively peacefully for years, increased nationalism has thrown their careful balance off kilter. More specifically, the last few years have marked a large increase in Israeli expansionism, and this has led to violent conflicts with Palestine, both within the city and outside of it. In fact, on the night of April 22nd of 2021, there were massive riots by far-right Israelis near the Damascus Gate, with these groups chanting slurs such as "death to Arabs" and "death to terrorists." Therefore, while Jerusalem is generally a safe place to visit, the recent unrest makes it somewhere that should be avoided at the moment, as only time will tell whether these violent demonstrations will become more dangerous. Number 7. South Sudan. While South Sudan may be the world's newest country, it is also one of the most fragile states on the planet. Located just west of Ethiopia, it declared independence from Sudan after years of civil war back in 2011, which allowed South Sudan's mostly traditional African southern region to separate from its traditionally Islamic northern region. Yet hopes that the nation would be wealthy and prosperous never came to be. That's because in 2013 the region erupted in civil war after rival ethnic factions began to fight one another, and as a result several armed groups continued to fight one another. This has been exacerbated by the fact that South Sudan is rich in oil, and thus much of the fighting has been centered around controlling these deposits. As a result, regular civilians are constantly under threat of violence, and despite the civil war ending in a peace treaty in 2020, a report made by the European Union's humanitarian wing found that 70% of South Sudan's population requires urgent humanitarian assistance, with a further 2 million living as refugees in neighboring countries. While South Sudan is on its way to stable governance, the current administration still has a long way to go if this situation is to become a little less volatile. Number 6. Eastern Ukraine. If you keep up with the news in Europe, then you're probably not surprised that Eastern Ukraine made its way onto this list. That's because the region's constant struggles with Russia have exposed it to all sorts of volatility, with the underlying issues surrounding the tensions being quite political in nature. While Ukraine has been at odds with Russia for much of its existence, its first major bout in recent memory came in 2014, when Russian forces invaded the region of Crimea. Now, Russia had given Crimea to Ukraine all the way back in 1954 and claimed that because it was still 60% ethnically Russian, it should be returned to Russia. While this claim had no weight in international courts, Russia still went ahead and seized it, causing significant tension in the region. To make matters worse, in March of 2021, Putin began placing Russian troops on the Ukrainian border. While the motives behind this move are unclear, many believe that Putin is planning a second invasion of the country. Therefore, until this situation clears up, we suggest staying away from Ukraine and instead visiting some of Eastern Europe's other travel destinations. Number 5. Tokyo, Japan. While Tokyo may not be all that volatile from day to day, the potential for some serious chaos coming about is quite high. That's because a study by insurance company Swiss Re found that Tokyo is the riskiest place in the world to do business in regard to potential natural disasters. Using a mechanism that combines population and natural disaster risk, the study put Tokyo at the top of the list because it lies very close to an active fault line, and when combined with other ecological factors, this puts it in danger of experiencing earthquakes, monsoons, river floods, and tsunamis. Nearly 80% of the population is seriously exposed at any time to large earthquakes, and if the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923 is any indication, an earthquake could lead to the near collapse of the city. Now, to be fair, Tokyo is easily one of the world's most well-prepared cities in the event of such disasters, as it has skyscrapers that are designed to sway, parks that feature hidden emergency toilets, benches that turn into cooking stoves, and a fire brigade that's not only the world's largest, but it's also specifically trained to prevent the kind of flash blazes that spread after earthquakes. Therefore, while Tokyo may score high on the volatility index, at the very least, it's well prepared for the worst. Number 4. Caracas. Venezuela's capital city of Caracas used to be one of the richest places in South America, as its vast oil drilling operations brought in billions of dollars per year. However, once dictator Hugo Chavez died in 2013, his successor, Nicolas Maduro, slowly dragged his country into dire straits. That's because soon after taking power, he devalued his country's currency. When combined with a subsequent slip in oil prices, a large increase in corruption, and what was essentially a continued destruction of the democratic process, Venezuela's economy began to collapse. As a result, the UN now estimates that roughly 7 million people in Venezuela require humanitarian aid, with this accounting for about 25% of the country's population. While there are many reasons behind this, some of the most stark include the fact that 90% of Venezuelans do not have reliable access to electricity, 44% of Venezuelans are unemployed, and only 60% of children regularly attend school, and 23% don't have access to running water. To make matters worse, rampant inflation has made the Venezuelan bolivar a near worthless currency. And as such, the price of very limited goods in supermarkets are so high that no one has the wages to afford them. Beyond the terrible living conditions, Caracas itself is also extremely violent, with the murder rate coming in at 111 per 100,000 people in 2020, making it the second most deadly place on the planet. As a result, it shouldn't come as a surprise the millions have been fleeing Venezuela as refugees, making the entire region extremely unstable. Unless you want to dive headfirst into the chaos, we suggest finding another country for your next South American vacation. Number 3. Mogadishu. As far as capital cities go, few are quite as chaotic as Mogadishu. Located in Somalia, this once beautiful city is one of the most violent in the world. Decades ago, Somalia was a relatively peaceful country, and Mogadishu itself was a prosperous city. However, after civil war erupted in Somalia in 1991, the government collapsed, and bands of Islamic extremist groups such as Al-Shabaab and Al-Qaeda began to take over most of the country. This led to widespread starvation, and as a result, Somalians began to turn to criminal activity, such as piracy in the Gulf of Aden, in order to make a livelihood. Now, while the civil war was technically ended after the recapture of Mogadishu by government forces in 2011, warlords still control large swaths of Somalia's territory and economy. Terrorist attacks are common in Mogadishu, with the bombing of buildings such as hotels being relatively common. Beyond the general threat of terrorism, criminals within the city run rampant, and as a result, foreign visitors are cautioned to stay inside for the majority of their trip. To make matters worse, the kidnapping of foreigners for ransom is widespread, and thus foreigners who do have to travel outside typically need to have a security detail surrounding them. This is not to mention the fact that violent demonstrations are common, as protesting against the government with the help of militias is widespread. If you do wish to visit Somalia, we suggest visiting the far more peaceful northern region of Somaliland, as a trip to Mogadishu could easily lead you into some serious trouble. Number 2. Naples. Naples may seem like a surprising addition to this list. After all, while it's famous for being a home to a lot of critical activity, generally speaking, it seems to be more of a vacation destination than a volatile area. However, it turns out that it is inside one of the most active volcanic zones on the planet. The city sits near the slopes of Mount Vesuvius, which is one of Italy's largest volcanoes. While Vesuvius may not be a household name, you may have heard about it from its most famous eruption, as this was the volcano that completely covered the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum about 2,000 years ago. Now, what sets this volcano apart is that it's still active, and it will generally have a major eruption every few hundred years, with the largest in recent memory occurring in 1944. However, since Naples is only about 20 kilometers away from the volcano, this poses a massive problem, as it's quite likely that the city's 3.1 million inhabitants could fall victim to its plumes. In fact, many estimates show that if an eruption were to occur, as much as 10 million cubic meters of volcanic ash and debris could be expelled, and this would be enough to spread hundreds of kilometers and impact the lives of about 6 million people. As of now, the Italian government currently has a plan in place that would evacuate those who are closest to the volcano, with the idea being that 800,000 people would be sent to host regions all across Italy. However, in the event of a real eruption, there are serious concerns as to whether or not this would be feasible. Regardless, if you'd rather avoid waiting for a government rescue mission, we suggest not visiting Naples when there are volcano warnings being posted. Number 1. Yemen. While visiting any of the places on this list would be a serious risk, there is nowhere on the planet that is quite as volatile as Yemen. After all, it is currently the site of the world's worst humanitarian crisis, and as of now, the situation doesn't seem to be improving. The trouble first started during the Arab Spring, when the president of the country was forced to abdicate in favor of Abdrabbuh Mansour Hadi. However, his rule was marred by corruption and scandals, and as a result, a rebel group known as the Houthis began to take over the country. Since the Houthis are Shia Muslims, the rest of the Middle East, which is primarily Sunni, believed that the Shia majority country of Iran was responsible, and decided to engage in a proxy war within the country in order to maintain Sunni power. While this war was only supposed to last a few months, it is now dragged into its 7th year, with the majority of the country still being controlled by the Houthis, despite armed campaigns by Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and their Western allies. Unsurprisingly, this war has led to severe shortages of food and fuel within the country, and as such, the situation in Yemen is dire. The UN estimates that 80% of the country is in need of humanitarian assistance, as basics such as food, water, and medical care are in short supply. The security of the Yemeni people is also near zero, as both Sunni and Shia forces have engaged in war crimes such as attacks on civilians, the use of child soldiers, torture, and the destruction of infrastructure such as hospitals. To make matters worse, the COVID-19 pandemic has led to many Western countries cutting off monetary aid for the country, and in 2020, global support was so low that the UN received less than half of the money it requested from world leaders. Therefore, war, chaos and famines continue to destroy the country, with a total of 4 million Yemenis having been displaced. As a result, it's likely that the country will continue to be a living hell for years to come.
We're constantly adding more people to the Top 5's production team to bring you all the best content. Be sure to subscribe with notifications on and hit the like button.